guys, so welcome to today's tutorial. We're going to be covering how to create fire using Unreal Engine 4. If you look at the effect that we've got on screen at the moment, this is the intended final outcome. It's a reasonable fire. It's actually really simple, not too expensive, and I think it's the kind of thing that really can add a whole lot of life to your scene. So the main thing to note today with what we're actually doing though is that the effect itself here is largely dictated by the material more so than the particle effect itself. So throughout this we're going to be focusing on both materials and particle effects. To begin with though, when you're doing something like this, it's always a really good idea to just get a base particle system that you can actually work with and see what's going on. So if you open up your content browser, you can see that we've got our base files that I've been working with here. I'm going to create a new particle system just for the sake of demonstrating. So we're going to create this new particle system, and this is going to be called Fire System 4. So this is the one I'll be creating for everyone today. Now if we open this up, we can see that we have the generic cascade interface. We've got all of our sprites just kind of shooting up in the middle here. Now the thing with what we have right now is that if I was to get this effect and drop it into the level, so get that and drop it into the map, you can see I'm actually going to click away from it so it's not highlighted. Okay, so as you can see, there's the effect kind of hovering in the corner over there. The reason I'm doing it in game is just because you can see the comparison between the two. But if you actually look at how the movement works in the base particle system demonstration, it's just particles moving upwards. That's actually reasonably close to the effect that we need to achieve ultimately in the long run. So I'll show you how to finally achieve this in just a moment. Now that you've got this particle system up and running, I need you to do one other thing, and that is that we need to start to develop a basic system that's going to be used as the material. So can I get you to please load your content browser again? Right click, and let's create a new material. You can see this one's just here. So I'm going to call this m_fire. In this case I'm going to call it 4 because I did a couple of iterations beforehand and I was just working out how things go. Now on screen you can see that we've got a couple of things here that are actually pretty important. We've got the preview, we've got some base settings that we're going to need to change, and if over here you can see this is the final output of each type of thing that we're going to need. Now before we begin, I need you to go to the blend mode and set your blend mode to translucent, and we're also going to set the lighting model over here, default lit. We don't need to light our fire, so we're just going to go unlit as well. Now you'll see that over here the only things that actually can matter are the emissive color, opacity, world position, offset, and refraction. Now while you could create something pretty complex, in this case I'm really only going to be worrying about the emissive color and the opacity. So the first thing to note when it comes to how we're going to achieve a large chunk of our fire effect is that we're going to need to get an overall shimmer. And one of the really important things to bring up is that when you look at a standard particle effect, everyone thinks of it as being like a bunch of clumps, a bunch of sprites that are kind of shooting out. But the truth is that that doesn't actually achieve the effect that we really want to get here. And I'll give you an example of that. If I was to go back to my content browser, look for textures in the game, and I was to type in, I'm going to look for smoke. I'm going to grab just an arbitrary smoke. We're going to grab this smoke fill because that looks pretty good. So you can see that it's got the edges there. I'm going to go back to the editor. I'm going to hold down T and left click. And that adds that smoke as a texture sample. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to simply run that texture sample into my opacity channel over here. Now if I look at that, put some cube view. There we go. So if I look at that, we can see that we have a clear smoke view. The thing with this smoke view is that if I was to bring that into the game, so I'm going to hit apply, and in my system, I'm going to go back to this, turn off my filters, and I'm going to set Fire 4, which is the one that we've just created, as the particle system. So I'm going to go required, and under here it says material, I'm going to select it. That's going to add my smoke effect. Now I can't see it because it's black at the moment, but if I look at that over here, this is the effect as it stands with the material, just the opacity. Now, this is where a lot of people start to go wrong, is that they look at that and they assume that that's all sprites are. But the truth is bringing a level of continuity into what you're actually creating here is incredibly important. And what I mean by that is, if you look at these particles here, it's actually the same thing over and over and over again. And something feels wrong about it. It's hard to really identify it if you're not aware of what you're looking at, but something does feel wrong. So we're going to try and fix that as we go along. And the first way for us to go about fixing that is to look at getting some actual consistency across the board for all of those particles. So what I mean by that is this. I want you to go to your assets and do a search for the texture. Let's do a search for the word rolling. I know it's kind of a weird word to look for, but I'm going to bring in a... It's kind of a weird word. Sorry, not roll. Sorry, roiling. If I look for roiling, we've got this roiling flame modulate that's kind of a default texture. So I'm going to bring this in, and this is the really, really important part that I want everyone to pay attention to, is if I look at this asset, hold down T, now left click to bring it in, we can actually get a specific node that we can look for called screen aligned UVs. I'm going to drag screen aligned UVs in and connect this to my UV channel. Now by default, actually I'm going to disconnect this just to demonstrate, don't disconnect it yourself, but by default, if I was to run emissive color into this, you can see that we have that picture is now being masked behind the smoke, right? But the thing is that if I was to get screen aligned UVs and plug that into it, notice that as I tilt my camera around, the actual position of that texture doesn't change in screen space. This is the key to what we're about to do, and this is incredibly important. In fact, to demonstrate it, I'm actually going to get rid of the opacity channel, so it's just a square of these, and I'm going to hit apply. I want to show you what the system actually looks like. If I go back to here, do you see how if I look at this system, it might be a little tricky for some of you to see, but the texture actually now merges between every particle. So what's really great about this is when I bring this in, if I was to connect my opacity channel back in, and then hit apply, and look at the system, as they get together, they share color texturing between the two of them, and then as they separate, they have their own separate masks now. That's the key to what we're about to do. So I want you to follow along as best you can. We'll see what we can do. So with the screen aligned UVs, we're going to do a few things. First off, we've got to create some variance. So this texture that we've added here, we want to have that panning as best as we can. So we want this actually moving around, because quite clearly staying still is not going to get what we want. So I'm going to do a search for the word panner. Drag it in. I'm going to connect my panner to the UV channel. Now with that in mind, I'm now going to get my coordinates, so my texture coordinates are screen aligned UVs. So I'm going to connect that up. And in the panner settings, I'm going to set the panner up to just, for the time being, let's go with something really simple like 0.5 and 0.5. So now you can see that we have a diagonally panning texture that's universal as well. So if I was to go back to my world, and again, apply that to just get a look at what it would look like on that system, you can now see that this line actually is continuous amongst the fire itself, which gives us this really nice rolling feeling, and it gives us this really good feeling of consistency. So that's a good start, and that's where we're going to work from. But let's go a bit further. So with that in mind, let's go next up and actually kind of start to get a few of the things that I'm missing in place. Now, if we've got this all rolling in one direction, it doesn't look too bad. But the truth is we could get this looking a lot better. And what I mean by that is we could add some actual kind of variation. Now, a nice way to go about adding that variation is to kind of get a second version of the texture. So I'm going to click on the first one and hit Control. I'm going to grab the panner as well. So I've got those two textures selected. I'm going to hit Control W to duplicate. And this time on this version of the texture, I'm going to add some slight variance to this one. So I'm going to call it, on the x-axis, negative 0.45, just ballpark. And I might keep the speed Y, I'll just add enough to make it slightly different. That'll work. Now if I get those two, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to multiply them together. So that runs into that, that, into that, and that into the emissive color channel. Now if you look at that, you can now see that we have this kind of like slightly nicer random variation. The other part of this is that I've clearly made a mistake, if anyone's paying attention, that you'll see that I haven't attached screen-aligned UVs to my coordinate system here, which is very, very important. Let's fix things up pretty well. So if I go back to my effect now, I'm going to hit apply and see what that looks like in the world. And now I've got that nice variation kind of coming through. So that's a really useful start, but we can go even further with this, and this is what I really like to do. So with that in mind, let's look at the idea of UVs themselves. So if you were to look at something such as the opacity mask that we've got. Okay, if you were to look at, oops, sorry, what did I say? So if you look at this opacity mask that we've got, I'm just going to right click on that and hit start previewing node, which demonstrates just that node up top. Now if you were to look at this, this is what we have by default, and that's not too bad. But it has no life, it has no random variation, it has no modifications. So one of the great ways that we can go about looking at this is we can actually bring it so that this, the UV settings of this, the actual like texture coordinate data gets messed around itself to create a more interesting opacity mask. And how I'm going to go about doing that is with the multiply that we've got here, up here, I'm going to grab just the red and green channels. Now the reason I'm grabbing just the red and green channels is because red relates to the x coordinates and y relates to the, green relates to the y coordinates. So it actually gives us 2D data. So now I'm going to get that, and I'm going to hold down C and click. I'm going to run this, actually I'm going to move this back while we're at it. I'm going to run this into red, green, and we've now got that in place. Okay. Now the next thing to do is if we were to get that, we would want to, if I was to right click, start previewing node, that's what that now looks like. And if I was to get this, I'm theoretically able to make a couple of changes. So now with this masked out, I'm going to do a couple of things that are necessary. First off, so I'm going to stop previewing, and I'm just going to show you the texture coordinate node. This is very, 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 very important that you understand at least roughly how this works. If I go to start previewing node, and we were to just look at what this coordinate node does. Now this actually sets out the coordinate system for a set of UVs. And what I mean by that is it lines up the pixels as to where they should be. And red reflects the one axis and green reflects the other axis. So as you can see, as the red values increase and the green values increase, it sets out an array of coordinates to kind of map data to each other. Now, if I was to get something like this texture that we've created for this mask, I can actually get this information and I can add it to, I can multiply it against the texture coordinate information. So I'm going to hold down M to create a multiply. Click. Click. And now straight off the bat I'm going to run this into UVs. I don't expect gold here, but you can see what's about to happen in just a second. So I'm going to go start previewing node. You can see that we've now created this effect, whereby it started to move all of my UV data around. Now there's a couple of issues that we're obviously having here. For one is I never really want to time that texture coordinate information to 0. I always want to kind of have it at least around 0.5. So what I mean by that is if I was to get this information here, I can add a clamp by holding down, it'll look for clamp up top, drag it in. Now here's where we start to fix some of what we've done. If I was to clamp this data up, just as an example, and then I was to add, thinking I'll add 0.5 to it. This is one of those points where art and science kind of mix. So I'm going to go add, drag you into you, you into you, and I'm going to add 0.5. In doing 0.5, I'm actually going to have to shrink this multiplication one down, so I'm going to have to times that by 2 to fix that. But we now end up with an effect that looks like that. So if you see that as a mask, this is where things start to kind of get a little bit more interesting. If I stop previewing this, and I was to look at the world where we previously had that kind of smoke going on, and I hit apply, might be a little bit tricky to see, but what we start to get is kind of these raspy areas on the sides. So those raspy areas are a good start. But there's a few things that I really want to do to kind of really sell this effect. So it looks a little bit strange at the moment. But one of the things that I need to do is if I look back here to this, all the way back when we first did that multiply, you can see that this is how it looks. But the truth is I really want to kind of get this and multiply it into change the scale of the textures themselves. So I'm going to get this, bring it over here, and I'm going to bring in a multiply and another multiply. And both of these are going to run into my panners. So this connects to here, this connects to here. Now this is going to look really weird for a second because technically it's multiplying by 0, which is not good for anybody. But if I change this value, because CA is unchecked, which means it reads the value from here, and I'm going to set that to 3.4, sounds good. And then I was to go to this one, and I was to set that to something substantially higher, like up to here, even like 10. We end up with this much finer grain look over here. I'm also thinking that I should change this panner around over here to just kind of look just a bit quicker. Thinking like that. There we go. So if I was to stop previewing here, and you can now see that we have that far more shimmer look over here going through things, which isn't too bad. It's a good start. Now, with that going on, there's still some other things that we're really going to need to do to drive this effect home. So I'm going to look at this and apply. Now you can see that we're really kind of getting that raspy area outside. Now I know you all wanted fire, which means that we should really look at doing one of the most important parts here, and that is setting this system up to actually be, potentially colorful. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to look for the node called particle color. Got particle color out, and all I have to do is this emissive color that's going into things. I'm going to want to multiply this top node. Now how particle color works is particle color reads in the information from the particle system, such as a color value, and it brings it into your material system. So I'm going to grab a multiply, run that into emissive color, and I'm going to be multiplying against this. Oops. Okay, cool. Apply. Now with that in mind, we're going to now make our first changes to the particle system itself to kind of get us a bit of a nicer looking file. So we're going to step out of the material for a bit. This is what you should have on screen roughly. It looks ugly, I know, but bear with me. And now we're going to set up the colors. So I want you to go to your system, and we're going to go to this one called Color Over Life. Now Color Over Life works in a very interesting way. Basically, it runs off of a curve. Now, a curve means that we set points that along, at a certain time, the value will be equal to this. At a certain other time, the value will be equal to this. Now, time is relative to the lifetime of the particle. If a particle is going to live for 20 seconds, then an in value of 1 means that at the 20-second mark. So what we really need to do is we need to think, first off, well, what color do we actually want this to start as? Now typically I would recommend in a situation like this, we started off with something that was very bright white. So I'm actually going to go with like 10, 10, 10. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to set this next value to be about 0.2 seconds in. Now this is the first big one. So I want this to have that really hot blue is really what I'm trying to get to. So I'm going to go... This is, again, ballpark figures, so we're going to fix this as we go along. So I've set the values there. The out values is 25 and 50. Sorry, 5 and 50. And now I'm going to click next to the one, and I'm going to hit duplicate. And off of this value, this is the one that I think really matters. This is that we need to now turn the fire into an actual fire. And as most of you know, fires are not blue. So I'm going to go red value of, let's call it 50. I'm going to call an out value of around just a second to find some good values. That orange is something that I like. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to rework these values a bit actually. Let's go with 0.5, 0.5, the 0.1 mark, which is pretty quickly after it starts to live. We're going to change that to to stay roughly that color, not really change to that point. And at this one, I'm going to be going 25. Starting to look a bit better. And let's go from 25, 5, 1. Let's then get that to then fade out towards nothing. Just duplicate again. Except this time zooming in 1, and a value of 0, 0, 0, 0, so it kind of fades towards black. Now with those values in place, I'm just going to change one other thing, and that's adding a scale color over life. I do this to just really easily control everything that we're doing. It's under color, scale color over life. Now normally scale color over life works as a curve, the same way as regular color over life does, but I'm going to cheat. Change it to a constant, and then I'm going to set the values to 5, 5, and 5. For those playing along at home, you'll see that we've now got something that looks a bit closer towards a 5. Now, another thing that I really want to do here is start to control some of the particle sizes, because at the moment they're just not quite right. So let's try and move this system into something that's a bit closer. I'm going to set the lifetime, first off I'll change, to be between 1 and 0.4. This gives us a bit more variance inside the system. The next one that's making a huge difference in what's kind of going on here is the initial size needs to be changed. So I'm going to set the max 5 and 25. You now end up with a bit more variation there. Next up, I'm thinking I might change size by life. So I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to go size by life. And what happens is we really want these things to kind of start, pretty much gone, and then really, really flare up. So what we're going to do is under size by life, at the in value of 0, I'm going to say that the out value is also 0. And what we're going to do is at 0.5 into its life, we want it to kind of flare up. Now, if you're looking at that, you can obviously see some issues there. It's not quite what we want. And this is where we're going to make our first big change. We're actually going to turn this into one of the things that Unreal has called a GPU system. So I'm going to go type data, new GPU sprites. And what this means is everything's being offloaded to the GPU, which means we can do some fun things. See this spawn rate of 20? Let's spew out 300. Now as you can see, we've kind of got this nice fire that has an overall effect kind of moving through it. This is a good starting point for us to kind of work on. So I'm going to look at that system in game just so I can just suss it out and see what. That's looking pretty reasonable as a starting point actually, but it still has a couple of issues. So first off, if I was to get this system, and I was to ever just drag it around, you kind of get this really weird puffy look behind it, which I don't like. So let's fix that. The way to fix that is we go to here, we right click, and I want you to add what's called a spawn per unit. So this is kind of cheating to fix this problem, but it fixes it pretty well. What a spawn per unit does is as you move a system around, it actually spawns more particles. So if we set the unit scaler to 50, and we set the spawn per unit constant to 50, now anytime I move the system around, it's going to throw some extra particles out, and we kind of lose that bubbly look following it that we had before, so that's good. Now the next issue is there. If you look really closely, you'll see that these particles just kind of clip with surfaces, which I guess it works, but it's not that pretty. So what we can do is, if we open up our material again, so I go to here and open up my material, we can now add a new thing called depth fade. Now this is very similar to a depth biased alpha from Unreal Engine 3. So to bring in a depth fade, I grab that. I'm going to run the final opacity channel that I had before into here, and then this into the opacity. And what a depth fade basically does is, as the particle gets close to something, it starts to fade it out. So now, if I was to get this, and I was to bring this down, you wouldn't see the change because I never clicked apply. Sorry, click apply. Let's do that dance again. If I was to get this, and I was to bring it down, we now have this really soft edge around the fire anytime it touches this, which is way better, way better. So with that going on, let's keep going. The depth fade in, I'm sure that some of you have noticed that the fire at the top just kind of pops out of existence in a way that I don't really like. So to change that, particle color uses red, green, and blue, but this alpha one is the one that we really want to look at using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply my final value of the opacity with that alpha here. So I'm going to get this, and this. Apply. And if I go back to my system, I think we could actually be lucky here as well. If I go to alpha scale over life, so this is again change the alpha values. So if I go to color over life, and I go to alpha over life, you can see that the in value at the start is 0, 1, and at the end it's 1, 0, which means that by the end of it, it'll actually fade those particles out, which is why we're already seeing that kind of nice effect here. So that's sorted. With that, I'd say we're nearly done. Yeah, I'd say we're nearly done. The only thing I'd potentially recommend adding is looking at the idea of adding some orbiting particles. So by that I mean some kind of like little embers that are floating around it, looking good. A good way to go about doing that is if we were to go to, I'm just going to use an existing material for this one because it doesn't really require anything too specific. So I'm going to look for the word flare is a really useful one. I'm just going to go to game. Look, any of these will do. I'm just going to grab this one called m_flare 03. I'm going to get a new particle sprite emitter. I'm just going to click this S button to single it out. And all we need to do to get these kind of like looking way better is I go initial size. I'm going to go initial size between 1 and maybe 5. Yeah, 5's good. We get them. Next up is under color over life. We want their initial color to be like a really vivid, almost orange. And we want them to, yeah, that looks pretty good actually. So we've got that. Now all you need to do is right click, add an orbit, which gets them spinning around like that, which is nice. And now with the orbit, the only other thing I'd suggest really doing is slowing the orbit down so it looks slightly more fire-like. So to do that, we go to rotation rate, set the max value. Instead of 1, set the max value to 0.1, 0.1, and maybe 0.25, 0.5. Yeah, that looks pretty good too. So what I'm going to do is we've got that. And the other thing I don't want to do is we want to kind of start them at a random height so they don't just pop out the bottom. So I'm going to give it a random height between 0 and 25. And now if I was to look at this system, oops, if you are doing what I'm doing, make sure you stop single so that they all combine into one thing. Oh, actually the other thing is if you notice these embers, they're all kind of starting really far away. A good way to fix that is just changing the offset amount. At the moment the offset is set to 50. And we really want to set that offset to something closer to around 20. Yeah, that looks okay. And now if I look at the system, we now have that, which is a pretty sweet looking little fire. It's robust, it can be moved around to create some cool little effects. And yeah, I hope you've gotten something out of this. Otherwise, I think that's about it. So in that case, stick around for our other tutorials. We'll have more coming in. If you can, I really would love it if you could subscribe to our channel or add us on Facebook.